Proud Boys member Zachary Rell was sentenced to 15 years in prison yesterday after being convicted of leading an inflamed mob toward the Capitol on January 6, 2021, in an attempt to bar the certification of the 2020 election, The Hill reports. Rell, who was the former Philadelphia Proud Boys chapter president, said he let politics consume his life and it caused him to, quote, lose track of who and what mattered most. He called January 6th a despicable day, adding, "I'm done with politics, done with peddling lies for other people who don't care about me."
Proud Boys member Joe Biggs, who helped lead the group's march on the Capitol, was also handed a lengthy sentence yesterday, 17 years in federal prison. He was convicted of seditious conspiracy for his role in January 6th. So interesting times. Folks are finally getting convicted for what they did on January 6th. It's taken a while for these cases to get processed, for them to make it through the courts and finally get to the point of sentencing. And I think it just speaks to the lengthy nature of our judicial process in general. I think they deliberately collected a bunch of evidence to make sure they could get this seditious conspiracy charge. Getting inciting an insurrection as a charge is something that I've heard lawyers describe time and again as something that's very difficult to do. But I also believe that there hasn't been anything as big as January 6th occur in our country for quite some time. Was this an insurrection? I think that's a big question people have. But I know many folks are pleased that this is a seditious conspiracy charge, that they're getting this amount of time. And it sounds like, based off of what they're saying, they don't plan on getting out in 17 or so years and trying this again. It sounds like these guys are pretty done with politics.
I think that these sentences are fairly ridiculous. I think they're way overinflated. First of all, the judge only ended up sentencing them to about half of what the prosecution wanted on these seditious conspiracy charges. And I don't know as much about the case of Zachary Rell. I believe that he actually did behave violently. He apparently pepper sprayed some cops, in which case he deserves a harsher sentence than Joe Biggs. But the Joe Biggs case, I think, is frankly ridiculous. The only thing that Joe Biggs did on the day of January 6th was he marched with people to the Capitol. He supposedly entered after other people had broken down the barriers and was inside for 20 minutes walking around and then left. The only reason that they were able to apparently enhance these charges to the terrorism level was because he was on camera shaking a bike fence that happened to be declared a government facility. When you compare the sentencing in these cases to other violent crimes where people have received far less time, you have rapists getting less time, murderers getting less time. You have the case of someone out of Washington who was on Instagram making threats towards the former president and his administration officials, pointing a gun at the TV of Jared Kushner, only getting, let's see how many years he got, just a couple of years compared to 17 and 15. You had the individual who burned down a police station in Minneapolis, collecting armor and weapons out of that police station, getting 41 months in prison. You have Anthony Weiner sexting a minor and getting 21 months. The person who assaulted Rand Paul in his yard got 9 months. So I don't think these sentences are appropriate at all. I think it's kind of stunning that that Joe Biggs was charged in the first place. Again, I understand the Zachary Rell case a little bit more, but it seems like the only way that they're upgrading these to terrorism is because these people were mouthing off to friends over text messages about wanting to overthrow the government, which is obviously something you shouldn't say in your text messages. It's unbelievably stupid. But based on the actions that these people took that day, it's clear that they didn't actually mean the things that they were saying. It's clear that they did not have a plan to actually act on that. This was, I think, a protest that got out of control. This was not an insurrection.
It sounds to me that the reason Biggs got this charge was because he was encouraging folks leading up to January 6th to, quote, get radical and get real men. Only hours after Donald Trump had announced plans for the rally to happen in Washington that day of certification. Then you also have Biggs playing a major role in breaching the law enforcement line and leading folks into the building. I think that's why he got a larger charge. And then And then afterwards, in podcasts, he kind of gloated about what they had done on January 6th. He called the attack a, quote, warning shot to the government that showed them, quote, how weak they truly are. So it seems to me that what Biggs did that day was premeditated. I think breaching that line to law enforcement and leading people into the building to break into the congressional building was a big part of this. And then afterwards to gloat about it. I think that's why we see Biggs getting this really hefty charge. I think it's a problem in general that we see such disparities in the way certain crimes are charged. You know, we see people charged for marijuana in one state getting far more years than someone committing a violent crime against someone else in another state. I think we've got to do something to really level out sentencing and have better standards. It shouldn't be rolling the dice. Depending on what judge you get, your fate will be determined in the eyes of the law. You might get a huge, hefty sentence with one judge, whereas if you got another judge, you would pretty much just be out on parole. It's insane how much discretion judges have, and I think there needs to be something done to really level out sentencing in the country. But it sounds to me like Biggs played a major role in what went down on January 6th and really escalating the situation from a protest to really a riot to an attempted insurrection. When you have this idea of, we've got to get radical, then breaching law enforcement, and then afterwards saying, yeah, it was an attack, and it shows how weak our government is.
Well, it says that he breached law enforcement lines, but it never says that he behaved in a way that was violent or that he actually pushed any of the police officers. He just happened to be in that first wave of people that went through. And actually what's interesting about the judge's sentencing is that they say that the fact that Joe Biggs is a military veteran actually works against him here, because they believe that he should have been responsible for stopping the other people from entering, which I think is a kind of ridiculous standard. Like, if you don't stop somebody else from committing a crime, then you also committed the crime. I don't know how that plays into the sentencing at all. I think that's pretty ridiculous. And again, for this double standard, I think this matters because you have an individual, Ray Epps, who was present the night before and on the day, January 6th, yelling at people to go inside, encouraging them to be violent. He was not only not charged by the government, but not even picked up, apparently, not even spoken to. The government has refused to tell us whether or not he is an informant, whether or not he was working on behalf of the FBI. We know that there were multiple FBI agents, according to a recent interview with the former Capitol Chief of Police, who was in his position on that day. He said that not only were there tons of FBI agents involved in this, but he was never told that they were going to be there, so he had no idea which individuals that were causing trouble that day were doing so on behalf of the government or if they were private citizens. And he wasn't told, again, how many there were. So all of this across the board, I think, really provides some, I guess, it doesn't help explain why 17 years is appropriate. In fact, it does the opposite. I think it shows that this is treated incredibly differently from very similar situations. If we look at the summer of 2020, with the riots that took place from members of Antifa in response to the death of George Floyd, you had very similar language coming out of those groups where they talked about wanting to strike fear into government officials so that they would act in a certain way. If that's terrorism when it's done by the Proud Boys, then it should be considered terrorism when it's done by Antifa. As you said, the language matters here. And so this double standard, I think, is just unbelievable. I don't see how there's a reasonable explanation for the 17 and 15-year sentences.
I really don't see those two things as something that could be equated. It's very apples to oranges or apples to Snickers bars, just like so far off. I think.
How do you figure though? Because what Antifa,
right,
I mean, you have two situations where in the case of the Proud Boys, you say that they were talking about getting radical. We have communications between Antifa members who were talking about wanting to put pressure or intimidate the government so that they would make policy changes related to quote unquote police brutality. And then you have two situations, one where there was a breach of a capitol, and then in the 2020 riots, there were also breaches of state capitals that happened repeatedly. There were breaches of police stations. So how are those two situations not comparable?
So, what went down on January 6th is very different from the summer of 2020 for several reasons. George Floyd was just the most recent case of police violence against an unarmed Black man. When I think back to the centuries of slavery we had in the United States and how people who were African, who were brought to the United States, people who were Black in America were treated, they were used as slaves. Then they had to face years of Jim Crow, years of refusal for them to be integrated into society or the formal economy, them being brutalized by slave patrol, which is the first iteration of modern day police, and then to endure trying to integrate into society when it's segregated through, channels of the law, through peaceful methods, then protesting so that they could be seen equally in the eyes of the law. Still, they don't have the same economic opportunities that people who are white in the United States have. And then to face constant brutalization from the police, to face the potential of just being murdered by the police for being pulled over, the countless times that the police have brutalized unarmed Black men is what led to what went down in the summer of 2020. It was the voice of the unheard. When you go to city council meetings and you try and explain that you are so afraid to go outside because you're afraid that the police could kill you, and they don't listen to you and they kick you out for screaming. That happened in LA countless times. You have no other option. That's why I think Martin Luther King Jr. said that the riot is the voice of the unheard. So it was a response to a murder. What happened on January 6th was a group of folks who were unhappy with the results of the election. Were they misled by some public officials who said that the election was stolen, that the results were not legitimate? Yeah, they were misled. Should we take that into consideration when we think about Joe Biggs, who himself said, that he didn't want to be considered a terrorist. He was seduced by the crowd and he moved forward, and quote, his curiosity got the better of me and I have to live with that for the rest of my life and I'm sorry. Yeah, this was a group of people who was maybe misled, and we should consider that. And we should consider some kind of form of justice where what's the best way forward to prevent this from happening again, not just to give them a slap on the wrist and lock them behind bars, but to equate these two things as the same. I just really don't see them as the same. To try and overturn an election that was fairly won by Joe Biden is something very different from fighting against centuries of oppression.
I mean, the only difference in your mind is that you agree with one of the reasons for rioting politically and the other one you don't.
No.
What do you mean no? You support the George Floyd riots because you think that they have a justified reason to do so. You don't support the Capitol riot because you don't agree with the justification from the people who did it, but they behaved in the same manner. This is why we have an unequal standard of justice. This is why we have sentencing disparities, because there's politicization of the justice system because of whether or not you agree with a person's actions based on the reason that they did it.
I think that my personal decision is not why I think one is more justified than the other. It's the reasons of the people rioting is why I think that it's justified for people to stand up and say, hey, we've been brutalized by the police for long enough and we're sick of it. And our social contract has been broken in this country. I think the reason for folks showing up on January 6th was because, they believed they wanted to overturn the election and had the entitlement to do that. I think their own reasons were bad reasons to be rioting and trying to commit acts of violence and break into Congress.
The justice system is not supposed to determine whether or not your actions are lawful or unlawful based on whether or not they agree with your justification for committing them. And in the case of January 6th, you said that the George Floyd rioters were the riots of the unheard. These people felt unheard. They truly believed in many cases that the election was stolen. They truly believed in many cases that the election was rigged, that the votes were not counted properly, that there were votes that were certified that shouldn't have been. And frankly, given the fact that due to the pandemic, there were so many laws changed in regards to how elections are run shortly before the election, I think they have a fair case to say that the election was rigged. Do I think it was stolen and that machines changed votes? That's a different question. No, I don't believe that. But again, the law should not be deciding whether or not someone's explanation for the law that they broke is acceptable to them. That's not how we determine justice in this country. Whether you murder someone because you think they're a bad guy or you murder someone who everyone else says is good, that doesn't change the fact that you've committed a murder.
Yeah, I think it's a very different scenario to try and break into the Capitol and to say things like you want to kill AOC and Nancy Pelosi. I think that's a very different agenda from the agenda of the folks who were protesting in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. It's just very different in nature to try and go in and stop a democratic process versus to try and show up in the streets and demonstrate. Those just two things are not comparable.
Well, the George Floyd rioters did try to stop democratic processes. They did enter state capitals and police stations on multiple occasions in order to prevent the normal processes of government. But unfortunately, we're out of time. We'll be back with more Rising after this.